crowd even being quiet for the test as well. If you're looking in the back for seats, you're looking in the wrong place, but there's seats galore up here. Don't be shy. All right. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I direct the Humanities Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Humanities Forum, which is the thing that you're at right now. It happens almost every Friday during the semester, and it's an initiative of the Humanities program, which offers the Providence College community a chance to come together and hear from and learn from leading scholars, writers, artists, professionals from around the country and around the world. Here you can engage in the life of the mind outside of class, even though I know you're in a classroom right now. You can explore diverse perspectives, encounter new ideas, and generally we hope that it will deepen your appreciation for the humanities. Today's forum is our annual Ex Corde Ecclesiae lecture, which examines questions pertaining to what the distinctively Catholic nature of Catholic higher education should be. And it's endowed by a generous donation from a supporter of the Humanities program. Let me briefly give you a preview of what to expect, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker. So we're here until about 4:45. The first, 45-ish minute talk, and then there's Q&A. And so what do you need to do during the talk? Your first and primary job is to close that screen and to activate those ears, because you're not going to learn anything from that screen. Trust me, you don't need it here. You shouldn't have it here. But once the Q&A begins, then you have to leap into action, because professors are not allowed to ask the first question. It has to come from a student. So be thinking, listening critically as you listen with your laptops closed, and about what question you want to ask. Your third and final duty after the Q&A is to walk down the hall, stop by the Fiandella Great Room. We always have reception afterwards. Criminally good food goes criminally to waste if you don't show up. So it really, you ought to. Okay. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Jennifer Frey is a professor of philosophy at the University of Tulsa, where she previously served as the inaugural dean of the Honors College there. And she took, over the course of just a few years, the Honors College, raised enrollment by 500%, brought in a number of major grants, developed a standardized classical curriculum for all the students who were part of that program, and also an honors residence for freshmen. So it was an immensely successful program. I'm not sure whether she'll talk about it all today. Prior to her time at Tulsa, she was an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. She earned her PhD also in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, and a BA in philosophy and medieval studies at Indiana University. So I guess it's a good time of year to be an IU graduate, I guess, given the current football climate. Uncharted heights. In her professional work, she's published widely on virtue and moral psychology, and edited several academic volumes on virtue and human action, including Self-Transcendence and Virtue, Perspectives from Philosophy, Psychology, and Theology, Practical Truth, and a forthcoming volume on practical wisdom. She's also writing right now a book on the ethics of Thomas Aquinas. But she's not just a highbrow scholar, she's also a very engaging writer and speaker. Not that highbrow scholars aren't engaging, but she writes as well for places like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, First Things, and she also hosts a podcast on philosophy, theology, and literature entitled Sacred and Profane Love. Please give a warm round of applause to Professor Jennifer Frey.
Thank you so much, Ian, for the invitation. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. Is everybody ready for some Friday afternoon philosophy? How many people here are philosophy majors? Nice. Okay. Got the philosophy bros right here, and that's amazing. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what on earth liberal education is. And I'm going to start with Plato. So Plato understood the philosopher as a lover of wisdom, right? That's what the word means. And he built his academy for students who wanted to pursue wisdom. So my question this afternoon is about the object of the philosopher's eros, right? Their erotic desire. Whether that object is only for the philosopher, or whether we should all have eros for wisdom. And if so, why and how we might do this. In particular, I'm interested in whether the university, like Plato's academy, ought to be dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom. Isn't it enough that we are dedicated without fear or favor to the truth? What is wisdom, anyway? And why is it that in most universities today, you will never meet a faculty member or student who thinks they ought to be pursuing it, although I presume that Providence College is an interesting exception to this reality? I'm going to try to answer this question by contrasting two totally different visions of what sort of knowledge is essential to the university. The first is promoted by Max Weber, and the other is promoted by St. Cardinal John Henry Newman, who is now, alongside Aquinas, a doctor of the church. And so I want to talk about these two competing visions, what's at stake, right, between them. And I want to conclude with some thoughts about how this affects how we understand what is liberal about a liberal education. So in 1917, oh, can you not hear me? Oh, I assume my mic is on? Oh, should I just switch to the handheld thing? Or it was my hair. Such a liability. Okay. So just keep the hair back. Okay. Okay, we're good. Okay. Sorry. In 1917, the great sociologist Max Weber was invited by a group of university students in Munich to launch a lecture series on intellectual work as a vocation. The students were members of the Free Student Alliance, a group that championed the idea of the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, Bildung or moral education, and academic freedom during a time when these ideals were under tremendous pressure from disciplinary specialization, state intervention, market pressure, and a world war. Addressing about 100 students in a lecture hall, Weber delivered an address that was surely deeply unwelcome to them. Because rather than give a defense of their lofty ideals, Weber gave an account of scholarship as mere expertise, undertaken with no ultimate horizon of meaning, purpose, or goal. Weber embeds his conception of scholarship within his more general diagnosis of modernity as a period of disenchantment. Now, enchantment for Weber is connected to magic. So a literal translation of the German word that he uses would be demagication. So whatever is magical on Weber's view is whatever cannot be shoehorned into the ontologies, epistemologies, and calculative rationalities of the natural and social sciences. The modern university is an institution that inevitably reflects this basic condition of modernity, and it will dictate what sort of knowledge it will be legitimate to pursue within it. So within like the basic terms of demagication, all that scholarship could possibly be is specialized expertise. So here's a quote from Weber's very famous lecture. In the present era, scholarship in both the sciences and the humanities has entered an apparently permanent phase of specialization unlike anything that has gone before it. We can feel sure that we have achieved something of real scholarly value only insofar as we have specialized to the utmost degree. Weber argues that the scholar is a professional expert who labors in the service of increasing our repository of objective facts. He's emphatic that it is not, and this is a quote, a gift of grace with seers and prophets dispensing holy objects and revelations, nor part of a sage's or philosopher's meditations on the meaning of life. In fact, real scholarship leaves totally unasked questions of meaning and value. This can be left to the priests and the prophets, but it is certainly not the business of the scholar, and any suggestion to the contrary reeks of the charlatan or the demagogue. Weber further yokes the notion of scholarly work to a technical notion of progress that is unending. future scholarship does not build really so much on the foundations of the past, but rather works to make the past obsolete. Tradition, on this view, carries with it no special authority or value. It's deeply unclear why anyone would study Aristotle's ethics, for example, beyond seeking some sort of expertise in intellectual history. And I suppose some people will always pursue that line of work, but for most people, there is simply no reason to learn what Aristotle said about anything. It's a bit of a dead letter. Weber's notion of progress has no transcendent horizon that is worthy of pursuit for its own sake. So what then is the meaning or value of this scholarly work? Weber's answer has three parts. First, scholarship gives us more techniques for calculating and controlling life. It helps us to better master nature. Second, scholarship gives us methods of thinking that are internal to disciplinary knowledge. So think of like analytic skills that sharpen the mind. It's good to have a sharp mind. Third, scholarship gives clarity about the means to whatever ends we have actually adopted. But what scholarship emphatically does not and should not do is tell us which ends we should pursue, or deign to think that it could help us make serious judgments about these ends. To render a judgment of value, again, would be demagoguery and abuse of power by the scholar. This is the inevitable result of the forces of Weberian disenchantment, which creates a situation in which, and this is another quote, the ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life and are simply a matter of private choice in the private sphere. Weber has really nothing to say about teaching other than to note that excellence in scholarship is causally unrelated to excellence in teaching, which is surely true. And who besides, quote, overgrown children, believes that advancing in scholarship tells us anything about the meaning, the so-called meaning of the world? Rather, if scholarship can do anything for us, it is precisely to uproot and destroy the belief that the world could have any such meaning. Now, one question that presents itself here is what sort of disciplines could count as science, as producing what he calls Wissenschaft? Weber is helpfully clear that theology does not count. It violates the terms of modernity in a pretty problematic way. So here's Weber on theology. All theology is an intellectual rationalization of religion's sacred domain. Every theology presupposes that the world must have a meaning and asks how to interpret this meaning so that it might be graspable by the mind. Weber seems to suggest that he would be totally fine with the academic study of religion so long as it never went further than describing the meaning that various world religions have purported to find over the millennia. Anything more than that sort of alienated, merely academic mode of inquiry would bring the magical into the disenchanted halls of the academy. It's actually pretty unclear what Weber would say about my own discipline of philosophy, but certainly we can guess that he would scoff at my own intellectual labors on wisdom, happiness, virtue, and the meaning of life, as I have the audacity to purport to say true things about such matters and present those up for rational dialogue and debate. Now, Weber himself is not a dead letter, right? I think actually the academy kind of forces us all to be Weberians in different ways, but some people are really flying the Weberian flag rather proudly. And the most prominent contemporary Weberian is Stanley Fish. So Stanley Fish has a pretty well-known book called Save the World on Your Own Time. And in this book, Fish argues that the trouble universities are in today is that professors want to do someone else's job and not limit themselves to their own. So what is the professor's job, according to Fish? He has only two roles. One, introduce students to bodies of expert knowledge and traditions of inquiry. Two, equip students with the analytical skills that will enable them to move confidently within those traditions and engage in independent research if they happen to want to do that. In a way, Fish's version is even narrower, right, than Weber's, as Fish would resist any notion that what he does is useful to anyone. right? And that's basically, I think, a result of the fact that he does poetry, which is fairly useless. Fish is, it's fine, philosophy is useless as well. I think it's a compliment. So Fish is silent about what bodies of knowledge and traditions of inquiry students need to engage, or why they would need to engage them, as I think he must be, as this would involve a value judgment on his part, which is forbidden. He's clear that no matter what you study, you must remain distant, right? You must remain distant from the material as merely academic, and thus ensuring that the stakes for everyone are very low. So you can analyze arguments and claims, you can interpret and debate the strength of the positions of other people, but what you cannot and should not do is engage in a personal search for what you believe is the truth of the matter that would affect how you understand yourself and how you ought to live and order society. Fish's defense of this limited job of the academic is that the university is the institution dedicated only to the pursuit of truth, and that the pursuit of truth must be a merely academic enterprise that has nothing to do with soulcraft. Students are not on a quest for wisdom, as university study has nothing to do with happiness or human flourishing or anything like that. Indeed, Fish openly mocks those who would pretend to be, quote, wise men, gurus, and saviors. The professor's only obligation, his only job, is to present the academic material in the syllabus and introduce students to state-of-the-art methods of analysis. Okay, that's why you're here. You want to learn those. So let's think about how Fish might understand my own discipline of moral philosophy. In an ethics class, he insists, students are not, as, for example, Aristotle insisted, engaged in a practical science that should change how they should live. No, they are learning the ways that philosophers have structured their inquiries and reflections about morality. What makes moral philosophers worth studying is not the answers they give, but, and this is a quote, the verbal architectonic or argumentative skills they display in their writing. So here's a quote from Fish. The genuine inquiry in which students are engaged is not an inquiry about what kind of person they should be, but an inquiry about what kind of person Plato or Hobbes or Rawls or Milton thought they should be and for what reasons. Exams must only test knowledge of Plato, not knowledge of what is true, considering what Plato has argued. Why it is important to know what these dead men have said about the good life is left totally unaddressed and somewhat mysterious. In the end, Fish says that he is defending the limitations and prohibitions of what he calls the research ideal. But that ideal is an invention of the mid to 19th century, so pretty recent in the history of the university. And I think it's safe to say that it hasn't been awesome for the humanities quite generally, but certainly not for philosophy in particular. It seems to me a reminder of the actual history of higher education in this country matters to how we think of its present and its future. So if you will indulge me for a few minutes, I would like to very briefly rehearse that history. Higher education in this country began with small liberal arts colleges that were run by clergy and grounded in a classical curriculum taught by tutors, not specialized professors, and this went on for roughly 200 to 250 years. Students were expected to receive a liberal education that prepared them for any variety of fields or occupations, and thus they studied subjects like rhetoric, logic, philosophy, classical languages, math, science, and ancient history. The curriculum was entirely prescriptive. Students studied what the president of the college thought they should. Tutors understood their purpose as making their pupils, quote, happy and virtuous, men of order and unblemished morals and industry. Capstone courses for graduating seniors were non-accidentally in moral philosophy or theology, since they purported to graduate gentlemen with the proper moral dispositions and habits of mind that could go on to any number of careers or further courses of study after graduation. Tutors and college presidents understood themselves as acting in loco parentis for the young men that filled their campuses, and the moral foundation of these pupils was paramount to the entire enterprise. right? So they took themselves to be engaging in a kind of formation. The product you were sending out was like the kind of person you were sending into the world. Now, the German influence on American higher education in the mid to late 19th century caused a sea change in how universities organize, understand, and evaluate themselves. By the late 19th century, the curriculum vitae became the basis of hiring, and the lecture became the dominant form of university instruction. The telos of the university, its end, was similarly transformed. Now it was to create new knowledge, rather than to pass on received wisdom, modes of enculturation, or the cultivation of personal morals. So this change in the university's self-conception necessitated a change in the curriculum and the basic structures of the university. Universities, beginning with the oldest, Harvard, switched from a prescribed curriculum to what we call the elective system. The elective system eventually gave rise to the now familiar balkanization of knowledge into majors and minors. And along with that, a massive explosion of departments and fields of studies, all of which was based on the idea that a student's passions and inclinations and political projects should be the basis of a university education. Now, an important part of this transformation was the creation of the contemporary professoriate, of which I am an instance. The self-conception of the professor as a knowledge worker was born. A good professor is measured by his publication record and his impact in his field. The adoption of the publish or perish mandate meant that facially neutral measures of meritocratic success in the university became yoked to the production of disciplinary knowledge. The best professors would be rewarded by having little to no teaching responsibilities. Undergraduate education becomes an afterthought, and the general education curriculum, a mostly incoherent set of requirements that might be addressed within a variety of disciplines, was mostly delegated to graduate students, adjuncts, or permanent lecturers, whose power and reputation within the university were little compared to their high research-focused counterparts on the tenure track, and that is a trend that has only further accelerated in the last 25 years. Generalists disappear. Wisdom, not surprisingly, disappears as a norm as well, and is replaced in the best case by truth. But if we're honest, more common than that, other ends crowded in as the real goal, as some disciplines began to question the very concept of truth and truth claims as just another vehicle for domination and control of other people. Now, if Fisher Weber, right, if these men are correct, then the liberal arts college ideal was always a weird and totally illegitimate medieval holdover. And only the research ideal is defensible in our new age of disenchantment and alienation from ultimate ends and forms of knowledge that go beyond mere expertise. What's strange about Fish is that he insists that his research ideal has Aristotle and St. John Henry Newman as its forerunners. But Aristotle's conception of liberal education and Newman's idea of a university, which is very explicitly based on it, I think could not really be further from the vocation of the scholar as advocated by Stanley Fish. So I'd like to turn to that now, to Newman and Aristotle on liberal education and a university. Okay, Newman's idea of a university, written in 1852, that's 12 years before Max Weber was even born. In these lectures, Newman advocates for the idea of a university that is focused primarily on liberal knowledge that is sought for its own sake, as this cultivates a habit of mind that befits a free person. For Newman, a university is concerned first and foremost not with the advancement of knowledge, certainly not the production of new knowledge, but its diffusion and extension through teaching. Now, Newman's definition of a university has nothing essentially to do with Christianity or the church. The university is defined simply as an institution dedicated to liberal education and thus to seeking and teaching universal knowledge. That's his definition of a university. Newman is most concerned that the university be a place where the whole of liberal knowledge is represented. It is not simply that no part of this knowledge should be left out, although it shouldn't, but that this knowledge must form a whole, or it must be comprehended as a unity. So like Weber, Newman speaks of knowledge in terms of facts, objective facts, but unlike Weber, he thinks that we can know facts beyond what strictly empirical methods might deliver. He thinks we can have knowledge through intuition, through testimony, through abstract reasoning from first principles, and he gives credence to tradition as an authority that must be consulted on matters of great importance. By whatever licit means we come to have such knowledge of objective facts, it will fit into a larger system or unified account of what can be known. So truth is not simply grasping facts, making true assertions about particulars, but understanding these facts in relation to one another as part of a totality, a comprehensive system that is universal in its scope. And Newman is also working with an idea of progress, but it's quite different from Weber's, right? So for Newman, it's about making advances towards seeing how the parts of truth relate to this greater whole of truth. And behind this idea of truth is a conception of what Newman calls the universe, the totality of being or reality, as something that is intrinsically intelligible or knowable. There can be no universal knowledge without this concept of a universe. And for Newman, this is really the key thing. There can be no university without a universe and universal knowledge. That's just the definition for him. So if we accept this model of universal knowledge as an ideal, a kind of regulative ideal towards which the university ought to strive in all of its intellectual endeavors, then you can start to see how all of the various balkanized disciplines taught within the university ought, at least in theory, to try to bear upon one another. Inasmuch as sciences are forms of knowledge, they ought to contribute to universal knowledge. It follows from this that each science then must understand itself to be incomplete without the other sciences in the university. And each must recognize the respects in which the other sciences are also contributing to the whole of universal knowledge. All departments within Newman's ideal university must understand themselves as making a necessary, but of course radically incomplete contribution to the whole of knowledge. Another way to say this is that each professor understands himself not merely as seeking the truth as an expert within his disciplinary methodology and perspective, but as doing that for the sake of something higher, something that transcends that, the universe, or universal knowledge, or what is the same thing for Newman, philosophical knowledge or wisdom. For this reason, philosophy, the discipline which is especially concerned with the pursuit of wisdom, has a privileged position in Newman's ideal university, much like it did in the medieval university. So here's a quote from Newman. The comprehension of the bearings of one science upon another, and the use of each to each, and the location and limitations and adjustment and due appreciation of them all, this belongs to a sort of science, distinct from them all, and in some sense a science of sciences, which is my own conception of what is meant by philosophy, in the true sense of the word, and also of a philosophical habit of mind. Now, ultimately, what Newman advocates is for philosophical knowledge to be communicated in every university discipline, and he thinks this is possible. He argues that we move towards philosophical knowledge of whatever it is that we're studying only insofar as we can begin to see how the disciplinary truth is related to that unified body of knowledge, the larger whole. So how disciplinary truth contributes to wisdom. And it follows from this that all university creatures, students and professors alike, will need training in philosophy. This might prevent the current situation where a famous biologist might publicly claim that the humanities have nothing to do with truth, since only empirical science arrives at truth. Like maybe just a tiny bit of philosophical training would prevent embarrassment for such a soul, who, when pressed by the philosopher sitting next to him on the panel to give a working definition of truth, or to prove by merely scientific empirical means that his theory of truth is the correct one, can only babble so much nonsense, as he has never been trained to think about or discuss what truth is, or the different ways that truth has been or is currently sought even within his own discipline. So I want to address Newman's account of what universal knowledge is for, what is wisdom for, because that is where happiness, understood as complete human fulfillment, enters his account. The pursuit of universal knowledge, or wisdom, is good in itself because we are rational creatures, and wisdom is a form of intellectual perfection for a rational creature. It's an intellectual virtue. It's not a mere analytical skill. Indeed, it's the highest power in us, ordered to the highest object we might study, the universe. Thus, as we acquire this particular habit of mind in our university study, we are actually advancing our own flourishing or perfection as a human person. There is no higher goal we could pursue, which is why such an education is truly liberal, in the old-timey sense of befitting a free person, a person who is formed to pursue the highest form of human excellence. And a university is important to civilization then, precisely because it cultivates this highest form of human excellence. So this is another quote from Newman. Hence it is that this education, right, that we've been describing is called liberal. For a habit of mind is formed, which lasts throughout a life, of which the attributes are freedom, patience, moderation, and wisdom, which I have ventured to call a philosophical habit. This is the special fruit of the education furnished at a university. So the contemplative habits of mind that a liberal education cultivates is good without qualification because it contributes to human flourishing. It fulfills the natural human desire we have to know and understand reality that so impressed Aristotle in the opening of his Metaphysics and Plato throughout his entire corpus. It is this natural human desire that is properly cultivated by a truly liberal education. It specifically directs it towards the most universal and highest object of knowledge. It asks us not merely to seek the truth, but to ascend to the heights of wisdom insofar as we can do this, because our fulfillment depends on this upward movement from the particular to the general and universal. And that's a claim that you might recognize from Plato's Symposium. For Newman, there is wisdom to be sought within any university discipline, so long as we ground the discipline in forms of philosophical knowledge. In principle, he holds out the promise that there can be wise engineers, computer scientists, sociologists, and lawyers. The key, again, is to cultivate the philosophical habits of mind as one advances within one's own disciplinary bounds, so that you can keep an eye out for that higher horizon of the universe. For it is this higher and wider horizon that leads us to contemplate the ultimate things, right? The thing that was like ruled out by Weber. However, we settle questions about ultimate ends, right? We cannot know how to order our lives until we address them. And so the question of ultimate ends is not one that Newman wants to leave to the private sphere. These are questions that belong properly to philosophy and theology, and not merely in an academic or alienated way. It follows from this, I think, that the pursuit of disciplinary knowledge must have an ineliminable liberal foundation. So when we think of general education, right, so think about your gen ed requirements, you all have them. We should be thinking of a liberal education, an education that seeks to instill those contemplative habits of mind that are necessary for specialized knowledge to be at its best in service of that higher knowledge of wisdom. So, right, no matter what you're going to major in, your general education should be liberal. Weber and Fisch's ideal of a knowledge worker living out the research ideal could not be more foreign to Newman's essentially Aristotelian conception of a university. And I think it's also out of joint with the history of our universities in the West up until very recently. For Fisch's knowledge worker is merely an academic expert, and thus a mere technocrat who limits himself to the inculcation of disciplinary skills in which he has been narrowly trained and credentialed. This has nothing to do with liberal learning, because there's nothing liberating about being trained to produce scholarship in Fisch's narrow sense. Fisch's account of the university is then, I would argue, actually opposed to liberal education rather than being a sane and reasonable defense of it, as he claims. A merely technocratic approach to higher education understands it as a training for a life of work, whether that is the intellectual work of the professor or the practical work of the engineer or entrepreneur. While such an education will always have its place in human society, a university education cannot be reduced to this and remain higher in any deep or meaningful sense that distinguishes it from a trade school. For no matter what career you choose in life, including the career of the professor, you still have to know what your work is for and what your money is for and what you are living for. And if you are never trained to ask and answer the question of what it's for, if you never let yourself wonder in a disciplined way about who and what you are and where you're going and why on earth you're going there, then I would suggest that you're not truly free. And then your free time is nothing more than a brief restorative period that allows you to get back to work. We are free in the relevant sense to the extent that we have cultivated philosophical habits of mind that direct us towards wisdom, towards the cultivation of a vision of what is true, good, and beautiful that hangs together and makes sense for us in such a way that we can live a life in accordance with it. A liberally educated person has reflected in a disciplined way about what is true, good, and beautiful, and has worked out such a vision for herself through the study of masterworks that have addressed such permanent questions. Such a person is therefore free, or at least more free, in the sense that her deliberations going forward will be guided by a vision of what it means to be a good human being or citizen that will inform her choices, right? Including, of course, the choice of what work you're going to spend your life engaged in, but also how to contribute to the common good of the communities in which we find ourselves a part. This is an interior freedom to flourish as a human person. It's not an external freedom to do this or that. And if the university wants to tell everyone that such freedom is none of its business, that these matters should be left to priests and prophets and sages outside the supposedly serious walls of the academy, where all study is alienated and depersonalized and measured by its usefulness to something other than human flourishing, then we really need to question whether there is any difference between a university and a trade school after all. And it seems to me that the difference becomes more obscure every day. Thank you for your attention. So I think we have like 20 minutes for, yeah. Do you want to take the questions? Do you want me to do it?
I'll bring the microphone to the hand, then the person will say what's up. Who wants to take the first question?
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. I was just wondering, would you say it's like the university professor's job to present like what they believe truth to be in a way that, you know, they're presenting it as objective truth for the students versus what you had said about like, oh, here's what Plato thought, here's what Kant thought, but not necessarily any one of them is correct. Like, what would you say is the balance there?
Thanks. Yeah, so the question is, should the professor just say, you know, what she thinks is true? So I think it depends on the class, right? I'm a philosopher, so, you know, to my mind, like, philosophy is not about me pontificating, although I just did that for like 40 minutes. But this is not how I teach, right? Like, I don't lecture. I walk into the room and I'll ask you a question, right? And I'll stare at you until you say something. That's philosophy. That's my discipline. When we talk about general education, then I think it's pretty important that be more dialectical or dialogical, right? So I can talk a little bit about how we ran seminars in the Honors College. 15 students around a table. There's a text that's up for discussion that day. The professor is sitting at the table with you, and the professor will open things up with a question. And the class will just go. And eventually, at some point, it's usually just the students asking questions of one another. Now, they're not random questions. They're all questions coming up out of the text. But, you know, the professor's job is not to be the expert in the room or to tell you what Plato really meant, but to help you understand what Plato is saying, although that's often up for debate, but also to, and far more importantly, to help you think about whether or not what you think Plato is trying to say is true, and why you think that, or why you don't. And so if you do that for 2 whole years, if you engage in that kind of learning, an interesting sort of formation happens. You know, and some of it we can describe in a really straightforward way. You become quick on your feet. You become comfortable speaking, right? You become more articulate. You learn how to argue because you start making bad arguments, and, you know, this is pointed out to you. You learn how to course correct. But you're also learning how to think, and you're learning how to think about the most important things that you could think about. I don't really think, you know, students ask me, and they probably ask all their professors, like, what do you think? And I will tell them, right? But I don't tell them in the mode of like, this is how it is, right? Now, imagine that I were a biology professor teaching in this sort of way. Well, I mean, look, some things are kind of straightforward and you just have to know them. But that's, again, not how you run a seminar, right? So if I were doing biology and it was just like some PowerPoints and I'm just getting information from here into your brain, I don't know, you know. There are lots of ways we could do that now with technology. So how are you going to teach biology in a way that's liberal, right? The way that we were doing it is to integrate like classic texts of biology, and also to ask questions in biology that are absolutely not settled, like what actually is life. Super hard. Nobody really knows, and all the answers everyone gives are bad, right? So I mean, like we'll kind of go there. So I guess my inclination is to say, like, no, you don't just like say, this is what's true, and then we all go home happy in our knowledge of what's true. But rather it's something more like a search, which is easy to get going when the questions are dialectical, right? Ask a philosophy major, what's a dialectical question? What makes a question dialectical? Anybody know? Like if I ask you what time is it right now, is that a dialectical question? No, I mean, it's just an answer, right? Somebody look, But if I ask you, what is time? Is time linear? That's a dialectical question. And it just means that there are competing answers, and that those competing answers need to be weighed equally in a rational way. So if you look at the medieval disputations, those always start with a dialectical question. And the whole point of the disputation is to figure out which of the competing answers is the best one. But there'd be no point in doing that if there was just one answer. Yeah. But not all questions are dialectical. But lots of them are. Lots of them are. More of them are than you think. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Other questions? Dialectical or straightforward? Yeah.
So thank you for that terrific talk. And let's stipulate really that Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum are the state of the art and what we ought to aspire to. One question might be, sitting at Providence College, is does a Catholic university look any different? And in the first paragraph of Ex Corde, John Paul says that the privileged mission of a Catholic university is to unite two orders of reality that are often placed in opposition. One is the search for truth, and the other is the knowledge that we already know the fount of truth.
Yeah.
And I take it that he's referring to faith and reason. And another very difficult question in a Catholic university, which owes some fidelity to magisterial teaching on faith and morals, is freedom and authority. Mm-hmm. So have you thought about those questions? And if so, what is the wonderful fruit of those thoughts?
Yes. Okay. I don't know how wonderful it is, but we'll put it out there and you can tell me. So, yeah, so interesting, just like interesting personal fact about me. I'm sorry.
Jen, try to move the microphone to the other side of your chin. Because I think it's pointing out like past your.
I'll just do this.
Okay.
How's that? Okay. Right. So I'm Catholic, but I've only ever been in secular universities. So I've always had a foot in two worlds. But you're exactly right to ask me this question. I'm at a Catholic university. So let's go back to Newman, right? Newman has this idea of the unity of knowledge. And he has a whole lecture about theology, right, and the need for theology in the university. And of course, he's responding to those who would like to crowd it out. And he gives a couple of different arguments, but he basically says, like, you can't have this regulative ideal of a universe unless you let all forms of knowledge in, right? And so I think what many people deny now, which I believe is incorrect, is they'll deny that theology is a form of knowledge. Because theology is in a worse position than philosophy or English or other humanistic disciplines, in that theology proceeds, at least on a certain conception of it, a Thomistic conception, it proceeds, its first principles from which it proceeds are the articles of faith, right? Dogma. And so certainly I have absolutely no problem with that conception of philosophy and would agree with Newman that the university needs to have theology present. And I think in Catholic universities, it's very straightforward because you don't have the debates about whose theology are we going to choose. If you're a Catholic university, the choice should really be straightforward. But then another part of the argument is that theology is the highest form of wisdom, right? That without faith, reason cannot be perfected. And I believe that the Catholic intellectual tradition has the best resources for making sense of that. However, it is my experience, going to Catholic universities, that very few of his students will understand or be aware of the sorts of things that I just said. Right, so if you ask them for a definition of theology, you're not likely to get anything like the answer I just gave. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I mean, I sort of, yeah, I see where you're going with this. Okay, so I guess I would say that even historically, like let's go back to the University of Paris when St. Thomas was there, right? His second stint at Paris, like basically killed him, right? And what were the fights about? The fights were about whether or not you could hold to certain Aristotelian commitments, right? And he's a master of theology. The fights were really extreme. And I think that we find similar kinds of theological infighting in the church today. Like I could give a bunch of examples about kind of like, what counts. And eventually, of course, someone comes along to settle these sorts of things. But I think there's always been just a lot of debate and disagreement, even when we have the same first principles, right? And so, freedom lies in the space between the general and the particular. And there's actually a lot of space between those basic articles of the faith and various conclusions that you might reach. So, so I guess what I would say is that some things are settled, and of course, it makes sense for Catholic universities to point to the things that are settled. But when it comes to students and what students might, think themselves, you cannot force someone. you cannot force a rational person to believe something, right? It just doesn't work that way by its very essence. And so I think, students still have to come to these things on their own. That's just a reality. And for me, I'm a convert. And I read my way into the faith, right? So I have a very different experience from my husband, who's a cradle Catholic. So I just think there is that ineliminable element of freedom in the whole business. And, I guess what I would suggest for Catholic universities is that, of course, you can keep those parameters in the full knowledge that you're never going to settle. It's never going to prevent disagreement. Never going to happen. It'd be kind of boring anyway. And you still have to let students pursue and figure things out. And you can't force that. Yeah.
One question that I have, I've got the microphone and you don't, and I didn't see your hand yet, is, okay, so a contemporary horizon of everything you're talking about is how is AI changing education, right? And one understanding is that it's making the liberal arts obsolete. It's like, why would I ever have to read a book or write a paper or even like make a painting or a documentary, whatever, like ever again, because I can outsource that to the machine. I'm wondering if like an implication of what you're saying is that AI is more likely to make knowledge work obsolete, and you would want to recover liberal arts as what's left over once AI has destroyed all other forms of human knowing.
Yes, thank you for this question. I had like a whole nother page on AI, but I just was like, I've been talking too long. I'm just going to end this. So, yeah, my view is that the age of AI, which is obviously terrifying and confusing, and we can't really wrap our minds around what's coming, right? But however that sort of pans out, it is, to me, obviously the case that a world in which artificial forms of intelligence can execute what I would call knowledge skills more efficiently, faster, more efficiently, and with fewer errors than we can. Right, that is a world in which liberal thinking and learning is more valuable than ever, right? And what's interesting to me is that people who are actually at the forefront of artificial intelligence, whether it's on the investing side and the profit side, or it's actually in the engineering side, is that they understand this. They understand this in a deep way. They say things like, we really need to have something more like great books education, right? We really need to have a kind of education that is very different from what universities are currently providing. That makes sense to me in a really deep way. It's also the case that the extreme forms of labor displacement that are on the very near horizon are places where it kind of forces the issue for us about what real leisure is, right? The scholar, literally, is the man of leisure. But how did the Greeks understand that, right? The scholar was someone who understood, right, that in the space of leisure, the real value of that was to pursue the highest things, right? That you were never going to pursue the highest things in the mode of work, right? In the mode of what is instrumental or merely useful. Because when you think about the good, instrumentality and usefulness cannot be ultimate. Like, of its very nature, it's in service of something else, something that in the best case is something higher than it. And so as artificial forms of intelligence take over that space of usefulness, right, we need to throw things into that higher register. And so in a way, as scary as I find AI, and I truly find it scary, it does kind of force the issue in a way that can be very productive. But I would also remind people of this, and now I'm speaking especially to students in the room. If you outsource your mind to technology, if you outsource your education to technology, you are simply hurting yourself. That's all that you're doing, and you can do it, right? That's the thing about freedom. You can hurt yourself. But that's really all that you're doing. Because when you go out into the world and it becomes clear to everyone that you can't think, it's too late. And you're going to regret it, you know? And the sad truth is that people can be very busy digging their own graves. But I just really urge you to think about not doing that.
And down here in the front.
Thank you so much. I take it that one of your main points was that we as scholars are reliant on a domain of value that we ourselves can't defend or
Yeah.
and you have a surprising ally in this point in a German sociologist named Max Weber in his 1919 essay Wissenschaft als Beruf, because I take it that that's his main point in that essay, which he begins, interestingly, with a comparison between German universities and American universities.
Yeah.
American universities that are run by big capital, as he writes, and that endanger freedom of the Wissenschaftler
Yeah.
in his Beruf.
Yeah.
So Max Weber actually is making the point that insofar as we're experts, we can't defend ourselves against the market forces that are taking over our institutions.
Yeah.
And I thought he would have been your ally.
Yes. Okay, good.
Why
Thank
are you reading him,
Yes.
in my view, against the letter of his text?
Yes. Good. So, are you familiar with Chad Wellman? Okay. So,
Just Max Weber.
yeah. Yes. So, Chad Wellman wrote a book called Permanent Crisis, which is really sort of a history of 19th century German universities. And so he's looking at kind of the creation of Humboldt and the ideas behind the creation of Humboldt and sort of what happens. And his little story ends in Weber. And so he was the one that really like put me on to Weber. And, you know, I think that you're correct that I am giving a narrow reading of Weber because, like, you know, it's a 40-minute talk. But I would push back, though, against the idea that Weber is on the side of liberal learning. I think that absolutely can't be true. And I'd love to have the argument, you know, afterwards about why it can't be true. You know, but Weber is not, he's more complicated, right, than I've let on. But he simply does not have the resources. He cuts himself off from the resources that he would need to be a genuine defender of liberal education. And any concept of a kind of higher, you know, modes of wisdom. So, yeah, I don't think that that's something. I mean, it's true that he's worried immensely about market pressures and state pressures and things like this, right? He's a sociologist, like that makes sense. But I don't think he has the resources to even have the concept of freedom that I would want to defend. But I mean, we might read Weber differently. But I would also say, like at the end of Permanent Crisis, Chad Wellman gives this defense of like the Weberian ideal, and it's tied to the research ideal, and I think it's necessarily tied to the research ideal. Yeah.
Remember, your job now is to join us down the hall at reception after you've given a round of applause to our speaker.